This is Dr. Z, Zachary Brooks, and I'm here with my friend Goodyear, and this is my podcast about bilingual decision making. Today I'm going to talk about a subject I chose for my dissertation. A dissertation is like doing homework for 2 years. It sounds like a bad decision. In some cases it is, because it certainly drives you crazy when you're doing this homework for 2 years. But in the end, I ended up with something I find super fascinating called bilingual decision making. So I'm recording this podcast from your favorite local library. It's an awesome place. Check it out sometime. So today I'm going to start geeking out about bilingual decision making and invite you to come with me and share your own thoughts about a topic I find fascinating, but even better, a topic that everyone can and does have an opinion on. The reason why is because almost all of us interact with people who come from different language and cultural backgrounds. And since we live in an interconnected world, we might as well do it very well. So once again, this is Dr. Z. Zachary Brooks with my friend Goodyear, talking about bilingual decision making. Hello, this is Dr. Z. Zachary Brooks, talking about bilingual decision making in episode 6. In episode 5, we talked about bias and biases. And in this episode, we're going to talk about biases. Eventually, we're going to talk about something called the truth effect. But for now, let's recap episode 5. So, biases. You know what biases are. They're the ways we think about things and the ways that we can easily make mistakes. Biases are defined as prejudices for or against something or someone. When we talk about biases, we usually refer to them as being unfair. And we can talk about biases like we did in the last episode, as someone has a bias of strawberry ice cream over chocolate ice cream. Okay, well that's also a bias, but usually we're talking about something that's considered unfair. Now, the last episode we talked about whether our decisions would change when using our second language when it comes to biases. And we reviewed work by a guy named Albert Costa and his team of researchers from Barcelona. Now this name, Albert Costa and his team of researchers, do a lot of work in the field of bilingual decision making. And what we looked at last time is just two things that they studied. One was called the conjunction fallacy, and the other was called regret. Now the conjunction fallacy is really fascinating stuff. So the conjunction fallacy is when we take two probabilities and we add them up instead of multiplying them. The probability of two things can never be greater than the probability of one of them. So we used the example from Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, and these are two huge names in the field of decision sciences. And the example we used from those professors is the Linda example. And Linda, we're told, is 31 years old. She works in a bank. When she was a student, she was very active in political causes. Now we're asked to think of her as an adult. And we're asked to answer the question, is she more likely to work in a bank, be active in a feminist movement, or do both, work in a bank and be active in the feminist movement, simply than working in a bank? And what we found is that people in both their first and their second languages made similar errors. So let's just do a quick thought experiment because I want people to understand what this conjunction fallacy is. So we'll just take these two events. Linda works in a bank. Now based on what we know about her, that seems like a very low probability event. So let's give that a number, let's say 5% or 0.05. And the probability of Linda being active still as an adult in a feminist movement, we'll say is much, much higher. Let's give that one a probability of 95% or 0.95. Now, if we put those two together, we get actually a number that's lower than the 0.05, the 5% chance of her working at a bank. In fact, if we multiply 0.95 times 0.5, the result is 4.75%, which is lower than 5%. And most people make the mistakes. And what we found, based on Costa's work, is that people using their first or their second language made the same mistake. So again, we have people from all over the world who are happily making the same mistake. Maybe not happily, but we're all in this together in some way. The second thing that we looked at had to do with regret. So Costa studied people with regret, and he found that people felt equally bad using their first and their second language when it came to regret over a poor financial decision. So the next time there's a worldwide financial crisis, just know that your colleagues in Tokyo and all around the world using their own language are going to feel just as bad as you do about losing money. Hello, welcome back. This is Dr. Z, Zachary Brooks, talking about bilingual decision making. So today we're going to look at research from a researcher. Her name is Lena Nadarovich, and her team in Germany who did experiments in Hungary and in Germany on something called the truth effect with people who speak multiple languages. What is the truth effect? I'm glad you asked. The truth effect is also called the repetition-based truth effect. And the repetition part is important to understand what the truth effect is. It is the phenomenon that the mere repetition of a statement increases its perceived truth, whether the thing is actually true. So you probably have an intuitive sense of this already. For example, in advertising, companies use repeated slogans to sell their products and services. And this repeated truth effect, or simply truth effect, works visually and auditorily. An example of a visual truth effect would be the Nike swoosh. An example of the auditory truth effect would be McDonald's "I'm loving it" slogan. Both have been repeated millions of times. The truth effect is also used in politics, truth statements, trivia statements, and untrue statements. So if you repeat something to native and non-native speakers, would it have the same effect? And that's the big question that Lena Nadarovich and her researchers asked. If you repeat something, would it have the same perceived strength, the same perceived truth to a second language speaker versus a first language speaker? So what do you think? Well, Nadarovich and her colleagues had a group of Hungarian speakers who also speak English participate in the experiment. So when the participants arrived, they were randomly put into either the first language group, Hungarian, or the second language group, English. The statements were translated and verified, so the participants doing the experiment in Hungarian were reading the best translations of English. Both groups were presented the same 56 statements, half of which were repeated. So you might anticipate what this means. So if you have a statement that is said once versus a statement that is said twice, what the researchers were doing were looking if the perceived truth of a statement came from repetition. In this case, if you have something said once versus twice or three times, which statement would be perceived as more true. So when the results were collected and analyzed, the researchers were very surprised to find out that the repetition truth effect was the same for both groups. That is, if you hear or read "I'm loving it," the McDonald's slogan translated into a local Hungarian McDonald's advertising, you perceive it to be just as true, even if it's presented in Hungarian or English. No matter which language, you perceive something that's repeated more often to be true. That's pretty fascinating. We're back, Dr. Z, Episode 6, Bilingual Decision Making. We're continuing to talk today about the truth effect, also called the repeated truth effect. And what we learned in the last segment is that there is no difference when people are exposed to repeated information, whether the information is true and false. They perceive the repetition to be more true. This happens no matter if the information is repeated in your first or your second language. Does that make complete sense to you? Well, not so fast. Maybe there are some other variables that can be explored to see if there are differences between first and second language speakers when presented with information multiple times. Well, that's exactly what Nadarovich and her colleagues decided to do. They decided to go back to Germany and do the experiment yet another time. They recruited German speakers who also speak English to participate in the same experiment with one twist. The Germans showed up and they were assigned to take the test in either German or English, just like the people in Hungary. Once again, there were no differences in the perceived truth when participants took the experiment in German, their first language, or English, their second language. Personally, I love these kinds of results. As someone who studied bilingual decision making, I love when I find out some basic facts such as people are people. I love this, meaning a man from Zimbabwe and a man from Canada don't necessarily make variant decisions because of their first language, and a woman from Japan and a woman from Poland are very likely to make the same choices, under very similar conditions. It makes me feel closer to people on the other side of the world rather than farther. After all, we are all located on a slightly different spot on a floating and rotating ball of mud. But wait a minute. If I study bilingual decision making, aren't I happiest when I find differences? Well, yes, that's true too. Nadarovich and her colleagues, they added a small analysis to change some things to see if they could find any differences whatsoever. Because for them, their intuition was that it doesn't make sense that there would be no difference whatsoever. So in the first experiment, the researchers looked at the truth effect during the same day. In the second experiment, the researchers looked at the truth effect 2 weeks later. Can you guess what they found? After 2 weeks, the truth effect was much smaller for people who took the experiment in their second language. What could explain the decaying truth effect for second language speakers? And that doesn't sound so bad if you have a jingle stuck in your mind and you don't have to listen to it anymore. The reason is because of semantic memory. What are semantics? Well, semantics have to do with meaning, and semantic memory has to do with general world knowledge that we have in the course of our lifetimes, and it's closely connected to facts, ideas, meaning, concepts, and wait for it, culture and language. So, there is a language and culture effect to repeated information, but only after time. So the disadvantage for this student may be that they have to work even harder to learn material presented in their second language, which sounds frustrating. Having studied abroad, using a different language to write papers, it's very frustrating. I know that personally. The advantage may be that people may be less prone to believe misleading slogans over time, which sounds like a blessing in disguise. So if you are presented with propaganda or slogans in a second language, over time, those slogans will be perceived to be less true than your first language friends. This is Dr. Z, Zachary Brooks. Thanks for tuning in again to the 6th podcast on bilingual decision making. I hope you appreciate how speaking another language can help you see the world in a whole new way. I hope you're starting to appreciate how your decisions can sometimes not be affected by speaking your second language, but sometimes can be affected by speaking a second language. So subscribe to find out more next time, as next time we're going to look at cultural bias and emotions. In the meantime, happy deciding.